Hey guys, this is another episode of the Gimble and Arn Show. Today we actually are taking a slight detour. We normally focus on players, on commentators. A couple times we talked to a couple musicians and a documentary director, but this time we're taking a trip into the realm of science. We're talking with Mark Blair. He's a cognitive science professor at Simon Fraser University. He's doing he has been doing some really incredible work. So Mark, do you just want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little more.
Great, yeah. So I'm a director of the Cognitive Science Lab here at Simon Fraser University. We do a lot of research on attention and learning, and got interested in doing some StarCraft research, I guess a little over a year ago. And so we've been spending the last year doing some replay analyses to try and understand how StarCraft expertise comes about, and what are the predictors of expertise, sort of across the skill continuum, and that's what we've been working on.
Now, if I understand correctly, a predecessor I wanted to say a predecessor to StarCraft, but it doesn't quite fit. A predecessor to focus for expertise and trying to understand expertise, if I understand correctly, has been chess. Can you tell me a little bit about that exploration, that research, and why you felt like it was inadequate, or StarCraft might be the way to go now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So chess has been, sort of considered a model system for study for cognition, for over 50 years, and there's been a ton of research on chess. I mean, when you sort of think about, the standard idea of sitting and thinking hard about stuff, chess is the thing that comes to mind, right? You're sitting there pondering over your move and you're doing your thing, and so there's been a lot of research on chess, but chess is difficult for a couple of different reasons. One is that not much happens in chess that you can see, right? So if you're studying, right, what you want to do as a scientist is take measurements of things, right? And if you look at a game of chess, on average there's 57 moves, and only half of which are a single player, and so you just don't have a lot of data about what goes on in a chess game, and so you have to do lots of really careful studies of different things, like you show a chess player, some part of the board, or you show them different kinds of board positions and see what kinds of, how good their memory is for those. You do eye tracking work to see, okay, what are they looking at when they're deciding what to move, and so forth. And so all of that research is really kind of hard to do. You end up with really small samples. There's a few experts, a few novices, and not a lot in between, and so that means that to make progress doing chess research is a lot of work, and it occurred to us that because StarCraft is producing a replay file, that the game is sort of automatically recording quite a bit of information, and because StarCraft is more active, right, all of your decisions are more obvious when you look through a replay file than you get in chess, right? If you're looking at their base to make some decision, then the screen moves to their base, right? And so that's in the replay file. If you're worried about mutas and you make some cannons in the back of your base, making cannons in the back of your base is in the replay file. And so, unlike chess, where a lot of the things that you're considering or worrying about are not really so obvious from a record of the game, StarCraft it is a really nice sort of a nice alternative in that sense. StarCraft's also really great because it involves sort of the strategic considerations that you see in chess. Other areas of that people have been interested in terms of expertise is sports stuff, right? So they study golfers and tennis players, and I mean any sport you think of there's been a study of, and so that often involves a lot of motor movements, right? A lot of your snooker shot or your tennis serve or all of those are are complex motor skills, and StarCraft also has those, right? So it's got the higher level cognitive stuff. It's also got a lot of motor stuff, and finally, there's a sense of uncertainty in StarCraft, right? A lot of high-level play is about getting a read on what your opponent is up to. When are they going to transition to Brood Lords? When are they doing this? When are they doing that? And in chess, it's all there, right? There's no uncertainty about what the position of the game is in, so you don't have to make decisions that you're sort of uncertain about, and you also don't have to scout for information in the same way. And so those are nice properties, sort of, to be interested in, and have sort of all of those things in one game that also has a lot of data automatically recorded is pretty fantastic from an expertise standpoint. It's sort of the holy grail of things to study.
I've got so many questions. I mean, I came into this, I looked at, and for anyone who hasn't seen you do have your AMA on Reddit. You have another interview you've done. Oh, and I'm blanking on the show. And I know there are also a couple of Scientific America articles and blogs. So I've been trying to read that. So I had a bunch of questions already, and then listening to you, I've still got more. Real quick, if anyone wants to ask questions as we go ahead, please do. We'll get to them at the end of the first half, and then any we don't get to then, we'll try and ask at the very end. But one of the things I'm curious about is we'll try and wrap a bunch of questions up into one here. A lot of us, or most of us watching, watch StarCraft or play StarCraft, or a lot of us live, eat, and breathe it. But in the same way that we walk every day, we breathe every day, we don't always break it down and think about the process that goes into everything. So can you tell me a little bit, or explain a little bit more about when you're doing this research, when you're looking at the replay, what can you actually tell about the actions taking place in the game, or what do you think you can tell about the processes going on?
Yeah, well, there's a lot, and the replay is an interesting thing. Like when we first started, I was like, "What? It records every action that you do? That's crazy. That's great." And we got in and we started looking through stuff, and there's a million things that are in there that are amazing cognitively, right? You can see people's response time. You can see how they're allocating attention around to various parts of the map. You can see there's a ton of stuff in there, but there's also a ton of stuff missing. So the replay file is a list of all the actions that you do throughout the game that gets fed back into the game engine to reproduce everything. So there's a lot of stuff in the replay file, but there's also a lot of stuff that the game engine takes care of that's not in the replay file. And otherwise the replay file would be huge, right? So, and because when you watch a StarCraft replay, you have StarCraft already, they let a lot of stuff stay in the game engine that you think might be in the replay file. So for instance, when you've got a hatchery that dies, it's not in the replay file that it died. Right? So none of the unit deaths are in there. Pathing so you take a unit and do they go around the left or the right of the little thing in the middle of the map? Well, it's not clear. From the replay file, does the unit go to the left or does the unit go to the right? What's clear is that you sent this unit to this location, and the pathing is done by the game engine. And so there's a lot of stuff that we can't know. We can make some inferences, so we spent a lot of time trying to make good inject detectors, see how good people larva injects are, and so the question is, okay, well, should you expect people to inject larvae to a base that's been killed? And the answer is no. Of course, the base is dead, so you're not going to inject larvae there, right? But you have to know that the base is dead. And so we can say, okay, they never inject larvae to this base ever again, right? And so, but that's not quite the same as it's definitely dead. All we know is that they stopped injecting. Right. And so you have to make a little bit of inferences to things like that. To see, to be able to say, okay, what are players up to? And in some ways, that's regrettable. Like, it would be great if we actually had information from the whole picture. And I think our first project has really been focused a lot on the more of the mechanics, because that's what's in the replay file. And we've tried to do some sort of strategic stuff, but that's typically difficult to do. Again, you end up having to make sort of messy inferences, and when you're talking about a scientific process, you know, writing a paper that says, well, we're pretty sure that, you know, like that doesn't fly. People don't like that. Scientists are not really comfortable with, well, we got most of the, you know, injects, and so it's a, you know, it's a bit of a you know, there's certain things we can focus on better and get better information about than other sorts of more strategic information. So the kinds of things that we looked at in the project that we're writing up now is you know, like the sort of standard game stuff, micro CPS, macro CPS, workers made. We tried to do a ton of sort of inject, chrono, mule efficiency stuff. We were one of the hypotheses we were interested in is that maybe novices. The game's really complex, obviously, and you know, and many of us have forgotten exactly how completely overwhelming it is to play StarCraft for the first time, or even the first 50 times. But it's an enormously complex game with 50 billion things to remember and so forth. And so we thought, well, one of the ways that novices might make that easier task is by just not making any complex units. So they just make only stalkers, right, or only roaches, or only whatever. And that kind of modulates how difficult it is, because you don't have to worry about upgrades for everything. You don't have to worry about all of that stuff. You just make one unit and mass it and go. And so we looked at things like that, like how many complex units do people make? How many complex abilities do people make? We looked at, you know, abilities where you have to target the unit versus abilities that are sort of targeting an area of effect, right? So feedback, you have to pick a unit of feedback, but storm, you can just storm any particular area. And so we looked at things like those sorts of things. And we also looked at some cognitive sort of variables. So because there's sort of a history of this kind of research and research in skill learning in general, we were interested in sort of tapping into those sorts of things and looking at like reaction times. And so when you shift your screen to a new location, how long does it take for you to do the very first action after you shift your screen? And then how does that compare to the gap between actions where you haven't shifted a screen, right? So the idea is that there's some additional perceptual processing going on when you're figuring out, okay, I'm in some new spot, and what do I do? And so, you know, you've gone back to your base, for instance, because there's a drop, and now you have to decide, do I warp in units? What do I do? And so that processing takes additional time. And so we look at the timings of those sorts of actions and the delays between shifts and screen to when the actions happen and so forth. And again, the idea behind all of these variables is to look for what variables are useful in predicting expertise, right? So we want to say, you know, what are the variables where experts are much better than novices? And so that's the kind of thing that we're focusing on. I'm sure there's like 50 variables. We tried a ton of stuff. That's the other thing, is like we've been doing this for a long time, and yeah, the project's literally like 10 times harder than I thought it would be. But anyway, but that aside, we've tried a lot of things, and there's some things that work very well, and then there are some things that you would think would work well, but we have tried 4 or 5 different variations, and they're just not super useful variables for predicting expertise. So it just kind of depends.
I
don't even know what the original question was. So.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Which things weren't? Which things weren't?
Which things stood out to you? Yeah.
So with I'll tell you the things that we thought would work that didn't. So none of the inject chrono mule stuff worked at all. It was just not predictive. And in part, so when let me explain a little about how we determine what's predictive and what's not predictive. So you throw a bunch of variables in, and we use this machine learning technique called random forest classifiers. So it's kind of technical, but basically you're making a bunch of really simple classifiers using a few of the variables in your set, and then you make a lot of those little, they call them trees. That's why you get the forest thing. You get a lot of classification trees that do a pretty good job but aren't great. But then you ask a lot of them to vote on how good expertise a particular game is, and you get a vote from all those little trees, and that tells you what your prediction is. So we're predicting what league you're in from the data that we extract from the game. And so the idea is then we want to see how the different variables that we're extracting, like macro, so we say macro CPS, but really we mean APM, but we don't calculate it in exactly the same way, and we didn't want to confuse people, but I think we've actually confused people anyway. So, but anyway, so like macro APM and micro APM, and so then you ask all these trees, okay, which variables were the most useful in predicting what league people are in, and you can get a measure called the Gini index of exactly how useful that variable was at predicting league. Does that make sense?
I think so. Just to make sure I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
So each one of these trees, they're like weighted differently, or have like I'm not quite understanding how they're distinct from each other.
Well, they're distinct in you don't give them all of the variables. Okay. So they just get a subset of the variables.
Okay.
Right? And so you've got a whole bunch of trees that have sort of partial information.
Right.
Right? And so you're making classifications based on a bunch of trees that have partial information, and then you see, okay, in like take macro CPS. You say, okay, in how many of these trees is macro CPS the most important thing that the tree is considering?
Okay, so just to make it a little more explicit, to make sure I'm completely on the same page.
Yeah, that's fine.
So you might have, just we take two different classifiers. One classifier might be consist of micro APM, macro APM, and injects, or injects chronos and whatever. And one of them might consist of, I'm losing track of the variables. Let's say one of them consists of micro APM and macro APM, and another classifier might consist of macro APM and chronos, mules, and injects.
Yeah.
So you would ask both of them, of the variables that you looked at, which one of them was most useful in determining league?
Yeah. So you end up with not just two trees, but you end up with like 500 trees.
Right.
And then you look at each variable and say, where is it in the list on all the trees that it's in, right? So for instance, if you find out that micro always beats macro, right? Macro is always the top variable in the tree for all of the trees, then you have some good indication that micro is a much better predictor of expertise than macro. Okay. So and now let me add one more bit of complexity. We're going to build up slowly to the mess that we made. And so the other thing we did is, rather than just do one classifier that classifies expertise overall, right? So you could really build one forest, and then you give it a game and you say, what league is this game in? Instead of doing that, which is going to get the most important variables overall, we were really interested in getting expertise measures from various points on the spectrum. So one of the real limitations of previous expertise studies is that experts are really hard to come by and they're hard to measure. And so what that means is you get a study where you've got like 10 expert chess players and 10 novice chess players and no idea at all what happens in the middle, right? Which in some ways is crazy, because that's what we really want to know, right? Like, we want to know how we get from here to here, and whether everything is is a novice or an expert just a novice like sped up? Is that what? And so you can imagine all the variables would be equally important, and they would just get more and more and more predictive. Equally predictive, and they would get more and more important. Your APM goes higher and higher and higher across all the leagues, right? That's one way to expect it to come out. But we were interested in saying, okay, with this technique, we can look at a number of different levels of experience. How important are these variables at each level of experience? And so instead of doing one classifier that took everything into consideration, we did classifiers that classify every other league. So we have a bronze to gold classifier, and we have a silver to platinum classifier, and we have a gold to diamond classifier, and so on. And we also used, we used up to Grandmaster, and the total sample was like 3,400 games, but a lot of those are from the middle. We have sort of fewer novices and fewer experts. But we also got 50 pro games from the players who were GSL Code S at the time that we collected the initial data set, which was last fall. And so those are our sort of 8th league. So we have 7 plus the 8th league. And so we have these classifiers that skip a league. We call them skip league classifiers. And you go all the way up. And so now you've got these sort of pairwise classifiers. And then you can say, okay, how important is macro between bronze and gold? And then how important is macro between silver and platinum? And how important is macro? And you go all the way up. And so that's how we're really getting a finer look at not only just how important is this variable, but how important is this variable at various stages of expertise. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Well, so what are you seeing? Is there anything that's really surprised you, whether it's been a positive hypothesis or a negative hypothesis?
Okay, so let me get back. I think I still owe you an answer to the last question. This is the way I am. I apologize.
No,
My answers are really long, and I go off back at the question. But so the things that didn't turn up. We're back to things that didn't turn up. So inject, chrono, mule. We could find no way of extracting anything that was predictive there at all. There was we thought like this complex units made or complex abilities, right? Like I remember being in bronze and being afraid to cast storm because it seemed likely that I would just storm myself, and even if I managed, or even more likely that I would just walk my High Templar right into the Marines and they would all die, and it would be a bunch of gas wasted for nothing, right? And so I felt like, maybe novice players are really not using the complex units or the complex abilities. So we looked at complex unit use, complex ability use, and neither of those were interesting predictors at all. So I'm not saying that they don't. So I like to make a fine distinction between predictive and changing at all. Just because it's not predictive in the model doesn't mean that there's not some difference, but it's just not a big difference, and it's messier than you would use to make a classification. And so if you count the number of High Templar that MC makes, or that compared to the number of High Templar that some bronze level person is, the MC might make more of them, but the difference isn't huge, and it's not overall useful in the sort of league setup that we've got. And so those things didn't work out at all. I'm trying to think of what other things didn't work. Yeah, we tried so many inject, chrono. I mean, with mules it's slightly different, and chrono even to some extent, because you can miss those and then just chrono boost all your gateways later, and it's not the end of the world. But with injects, it felt like you miss an inject and you're that's bad. Right. But we couldn't find any way of making that into a really useful predictor. So I know that some people are really focused on like, I'm gonna work on my inject timing, and I think you're probably not spending your practice time in the right spot necessarily if you're doing that. I mean, unless you're really good, like if you're when you're in the very top tier players. Right. But I don't really know any of those players. Well, we've got a couple of Masters League players, but sort of standard masters, not like mystical masters, really good. So anyway, so those are the kinds of variables that didn't really work out. There was a number of variables that were useful sort of overall, but which came in and out of use. So the first one and the most, in some sense, somewhat surprising one was macro CPS. So macro CPS was useful for distinguishing bronze players from gold players, and not useful for anything else. After gold, there was no, and not even gold, because silver and platinum you should still see it. After the first classifier, after bronze to gold, there was no useful difference in the number of macro actions that players are playing. And obviously there's some strategies at higher levels where you stop making workers and you two-base all in, right? And you're not making any more barracks, you're not expanding, you're not doing any macro-y things. You've got a strong timing attack, and you play and you win, and that's that. And so, but that was one of the sort of surprising ones. Number of workers made was useful for the first couple, but was never one of the strong predictors of performance. So it was moderate, it was significant, but not one of the top ones for the first three classifiers. So up through, what is that? Bronze to gold, silver to platinum, and gold to diamond. And it was okay in those leagues, not great, but okay. And then nothing after that. It turned out the pros actually made fewer workers than Grandmaster. Which may have been a slight bias in our sample. We had a lot of sort of, in that era of GSL, there was a lot of Terran players, I think, doing a lot of, sort of all-in-ish sort of things. So I thought that was sort of interesting, right? The sort of basic idea that you need to macro well, and I think it's true. You absolutely need to macro well. It isn't. It's useful and important at the very low leagues, but not so. Once you get that sorted out, then not much changes as you sort of get up there. There's but the differences are small, and they're not nearly as important as some of the other things. Other things we looked at. So that was sort of macro and workers made. Micro CPS or micro APM turned out was sort of a middle of the pack classifier in the low leagues, and climbed steadily up to number one at the highest leagues. And so between Grandmaster and Pro, and Masters and Pro, it was the number one classifier, the number one variable. So micro overall matters way more than macro in predicting expertise in StarCraft. So that was interesting to me, and so so that's something to think about. I think the community in general, and we will get to this later, but I think the community in general could do more to make custom maps and ways of practicing and honing specific sorts of skills, and I think micro skills. Obviously there's a lot of custom maps that do that.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of them don't do that very well, in my opinion, and I feel like we, as a community, if we want to raise the level of performance in StarCraft 2, I think we need to be spending a bit more time on targeting specific skills and a bit less time laddering. Because laddering, I think, is probably not very good for your game overall. I think it's interesting. It's like one of those things, in an ideal world, right? You can imagine these old kung fu movies, right, where you want to learn the kung fu, and what you do is don't fight everybody in the village all the time. You go find the master, you go up into the mountains, and you do what the master tells you to do for, what seems to be about 4 minutes usually in the movies, and then and then then you do it, and I think that's something like there's something right about that you need to practice specific skills intently and deliberately, and not just ladder all the time, because I think that's one of the interesting big differences that I see between StarCraft as a community and any other area of expertise that's typically studied, right? So if you study, dance, right? So people study dance, people study tennis, people study chess, and there's very specific skills that get focused on and very specific training regimens that are the basics. Take piano, you play scales to death till your fingers fall off. Yeah. And in StarCraft, there's a lot of things that you could practice that are like scales, right? Practicing your hotkeys so that you don't think about that stuff, right? So that takes up no cognitive effort at all to do things like that, and that frees up a little mental effort for strategy, for scouting, for other sorts of high-level things that you simply don't have the resources for at the lower levels. But I think a lot of people just play games, and so you're spending a lot of time, doing things other than real specific targeted sorts of training. Other things that we found important. Sorry, I'm getting back to the question now. What else did we find? We found, so we looked at all these PAC variables. We call them PACs, perception action cycles. So you go to a screen move, and after a screen move, you look at a particular spot on the screen for a certain amount of time, and then you shift the screen again to someplace else, right? So this is what you do with your eye all day long, right? You look in one spot, it sits there for a second, it fixates on something, and then it saccades or moves to some other location, and then it sits there for a brief amount of time, often less than a second, and then you shift to someplace else. So you do the same thing with your screen when you play StarCraft. You're looking at a particular location, and then you look someplace else, and you look someplace else. And so when you look at someplace, typically what you're looking at someplace is to do something, right? You're looking, just like in the world, when you look at your mug, you look in order to go reach and grab your mug, right? So you look in order to do, right? You look at something in order to interact with something. And so the same thing is true in StarCraft, right? You typically don't just look at things and then not do anything. You're looking, you send a unit there. You look because you want to attack attack some enemy troops. You look because that's where you're going to place your command center when you expand. And so the game is sort of divided up into these what we call perception action cycles. So you look someplace, you fixate on it, and the fixations we actually, interestingly, side note again, we use the same algorithm to define fixations in game that we actually do with our eye movement stuff. We do a lot of eye tracking. We're an attentional learning sort of lab, right? And we use the same algorithms to define fixations in game that we use to define fixations out of game. The parameter settings are slightly different, but we can actually feed in the screen movement data and see, okay, this is a fixation. And you have to do that because you'll get screen moves where people drag, not so much in the higher leagues, but lower leagues you drag, and at the lower leagues, they're literally drag from one base to the other, like drag, 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 drag. And on the replay, it just looks like a 50 million screen moves all in, it's like screen move, screen move, screen move, screen move, screen move, and so you have to sort of filter that out because it's essentially noise. You're not doing anything. You're just moving the screen. And so we use the fixation algorithm to define fixations and filter out some of that junk that's in the middle. Yeah. So a perception action cycle is a fixation, and then you do some things. There's some actions. I'm trying to put my hand somewhere that's not in front of my face. So you start a fixation, and then you have a bunch of actions, and then you shift your attention to some other place. So that look, do, and then shift is what we call a perception action cycle. Now, actions are distributed at various places inside of a perception action cycle. Yeah. And one of the most interesting actions is the very first action. So how long does it take you to shift your attention and then do something, right? And so that's analogous to reaction time in a lot of different sort of classic studies. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that that how long until you actually do the first action is an enormously good predictor of expertise. So your basic reaction time when you shift to screen, how long does it take you to do something right after that, is a great predictor all the way up to the very highest level of play. It's not predictive at the top end. I think because people are all pretty much similar at the top end, but it's the number one predictor on the way up. So anywhere up to masters, it's the number one predictor of expertise. So if you can give me a game and I can tell you, what league you're in with pretty good accuracy based on just that particular number. There's a number of other aspects of the perception action cycle that are also important, like the gap between packs. So the gap from the end of the last one to the beginning of the next one. So how much space there is where you're sort of looking at nothing much in particular. Yep. The smaller that is, the better you are, obviously. But that's a particularly important variable at the very expert level. So between masters and pro, it becomes a pretty good predictor. So that seems to develop sort of late, right? So your ability to really pay attention to all and only, useful stuff is a good predictor at the higher level, at the higher levels. And so those are the main predictors. I feel like I'm missing something. Oh yeah. Okay. So I'm missing the third component. So there's sort of three clusters that we did. We did the game APM workers made sort of stuff. That's one sort of set of variables. Then we did all these pack variables, which were very interesting and very good predictors. And in some ways, I was really glad those were good predictors because you sort of have to have a bit of cognitive science background to have thought of them, which is good. So it's nice to know that something I knew in advance was useful in doing this study. And then the third set of variables are sort of interface variables, like hotkeys used and use of off-screen actions, particularly hotkey actions. Not hotkey, like attack move on the minimap turned out to be actually a really interesting predictor. So those predictors are important in the middle of the range. So hotkeys start. They're not predictive in silver to or bronze to gold, but they're predictive starting silver to platinum and up through masters. Interesting. And so the more hotkey selects that you're doing in a game, then the more likely then that's related to expertise. So experts are doing a lot more hotkey selects, and so that's picking particular units, having things hotkeyed to sort of manage all of the numbers of units that you're dealing with, and those were important in the middle. At Masters to Pro, and then at Diamond to Grandmasters, using the minimap to attack move they took a big jump in attack moves to the minimap in those two leagues at Masters and Grandmasters and Pro, and so those classifiers were really liked attack off screen. We call it attack off screen, but it's really just a move on the minimap. And that was a really interesting one too. In part because it was pretty discontinuous. Like it was slowing. It was gradually going up, and then you hit Grandmaster and Pro, and there's a big jump. It's the biggest jump, sort of in the study actually. Everything else was relatively continuous, but this was a big jump. And that's I can't causally we don't know what's what, right? Because it's just a sort of correlational study. But so it could go either way. It could be that for instance, that pros and high-level players are looking at the minimap a lot more, and therefore it becomes easy for them to attack move just on the minimap, because that's where they see troops and that's where they see troop movement, right, is on the minimap. And so because they're looking at the minimap more, then actions on the minimap are much easier to do than shifting the screen and clicking on an actual thing in the main screen. It's just easier to go bang. Or it could be that that there's some advantage to doing that other than the attentional allocation thing, and so it's sort of hard to sort out.
Sure.
One of the things that we in the long term that we would like to do is to do experimental stuff. One of the reasons we're really excited about StarCraft as a model system is because of the game editor, the Galaxy editor, allows you to create. You imagine doing a custom map where the minimap was like black all the time, and you could compare players' performance on these key variables with the minimap black versus the minimap having all the information there, and get a sense of how much is that information really being used in the game, and how much does that influence people's performance, and so you could do sort of controlled lab studies, except the lab studies are just out there on the internet, and people could download the custom map and do the run through, and then send you replays, and you could actually analyze the data. So and so that's really exciting too, because it's all great to do these correlational studies, and we're finding the very interesting things and understanding something about the nature of expertise and how it changes. Right. But unless you can do some well-controlled experimental studies, it's hard to make causal connections between things, right? All we know is that this goes up at the same time that expertise goes up, and so it's hard to it's sort of hard to know it's hard to know precisely unless you do some experimental studies. But the game actually sort of allows that. I mean, I have this crazy idea. Can I tell you my crazy idea, or do you have other questions?
I'd love to hear it. No, go for it.
I'm sort of on a rant, so
that's perfectly fine.
Best let me go, I think. I have this idea for the StarCraft Academy, and what I think the StarCraft Academy would be is people would sign up. Maybe even through Blizzard. Maybe Blizzard could set this up, where you sign up and you play your games, and all your replays from all your games automatically get added to the StarCraft Academy database. Then the database is analyzing your replays to find out what aspects of your game are good and what aspects of your game need some work, right? Imagine that it's it's saying, okay, look, your workers is not great, right? Your workers made is not great at this level, or your stalker micro is awful compared to other people in your league. Yeah. Then it could actually make recommendations for specific things you would do to improve. So it would be like, imagine some little, some dude with a tough voice who says, soldier, your marine micro sucks, and you got to go back to training. And then it gives you a custom map that's designed solely around improving your micro, right? So then you've got a bunch of sort of fun activities that aren't just grinding away ladder games, but that are actually improving your abilities, so that when you go back in game, you can do it. And one of the problems here is that the ladder is such that necessarily so that you're going to lose half your games, right? And losing sucks. And so you play and you lose half your games, and you never feel like you're getting better. And maybe you get promoted and you're like, woohoo. But for most of us, it's not like you're getting promoted every other week, and so there's not a great feeling of progress, right? And that's similar to any other sort of thing, right? Like if you're playing tennis or you're doing any of these other things, there's always this sense of like, oh, my serve's getting stronger, or my whatever is getting better, and often there's a coach there saying good job, and a lot of that doesn't happen in StarCraft, and I think it impacts people's ability to get better, right? The motivation, getting better at anything is easy. It's like people say, oh, how do you become an expert? I can tell you how to become an expert right now in one word: practice. Just practice. That's it. All you got to do is practice. It's not rocket science. Just practice. But the problem is that practice is hard. If how do you get somebody to practice? Well, I don't have such a clear answer for that. That's the hard part. But I do think having some kind of thing that's skill building in the right kind of way, that practices deliberate, measurable skills, and you can show improvement. You can imagine like a leaderboard where you can compare your micro to other people, and it can even say, oh, look, I'm the best bronze microer in the planet or something. And that could be really useful for players. And then not only that, because you can do all of this stuff, you can say, okay, what's somebody's micro before they do this training, right? Before they play this custom game. And then you can keep track of what their micro is after. And so not only does the micro trainer allow you to evaluate your own skills, how you do allows you to evaluate how good the trainer is. So that imagine like a ranking system for trainers, right? Where the rank of like your custom map for micro is depending on how good people are after they actually use it. Because you could actually measure, okay, they're this good before they practice for this for 10 hours, and then they're this good afterwards, and this one really works. Where you might have another one that looks kind of cool, but doesn't really do anything. Right? I mean, because like have you played the StarCraft Master, the Blizzard little custom mappy thing? Did you do that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that they're trying to do that kind of stuff. I mean, I think it's absolutely a wonderful, positive thing. And I think there were a few of those missions that were legitimately useful. But there's some of them that just felt like it was like a little puzzle, and it wasn't like a practical use in game. It was just like, oh, I got to find out the little trick of how to position this thing that you would literally never do in a game. Like nobody ever would sit there and be like, oh, I'm going to put my High Templar exactly this place and tiny bit to the left, and you would never do that in game. And yet, that's what you're. I'm going to practice this StarCraft Master to get better. I mean, I think you could have things like that were fun to do and interesting and challenging, but also helped you improve your game. And so that's sort of my big crazy idea, is this StarCraft Academy where as a scientist we can be analyzing variables, right? We can understand how players are improving and how players that do, how much playing of these custom games is good for you. There's some ratio of 50% of your time you want to be doing kind of custom game directed practice stuff, and 50% of the time you want to ladder, right? Or whatever. And you could actually look across players. Okay, the guys who are doing this are the ones who are improving fastest, so you could make really informed, helpful suggestions for players on how to improve. But you can also then, as a scientist, understand what kinds of things actually lead to real improvement. So it's not a matter of like just looking at, oh, experts are here and novices are here, and experts are great and novices suck. It's these specific things in this specific combination get you from this point to this point. And that kind of sort of control over the phenomenon is what, when you can do that, you really understand the phenomenon. And I think until we can have legitimate, useful advice for people trying to move up the expertise spectrum, until we can do that, then it's not clear, how much use the scientific knowledge in some sense is. And I think to the extent that you can do that is the extent that you can also begin to think about how the studies of StarCraft expertise can inform other kinds of things, right? So you can think about, air traffic controllers, and how do you train them to be vigilant and to pay attention to the alerts that the software is giving you, but also be able to keep your attention on the particular planes that you're most worried about, and there's some analogies to StarCraft. That would be really useful, right? Because right now, this instant, there's thousands and thousands of StarCraft games being played, like right this minute. But you would never get that much data from air traffic control or from emergency management software design. Or, I mean, the people designing those software systems to do those sorts of jobs have no way to get the kind of data that we can get in StarCraft. And so, you know, understanding how the things that are analogous play out in StarCraft could be really useful for designing these other sort of more real-world systems.
Huh. So if I'm hearing your dream though correctly, it sounds like you really just want more data, and you want more ways to get data.
Yeah, as a scientist, I want more data, and I want more ways to get data, and I want ways to try things out.
Right.
I mean, in science, you do experiments, right? You have group A and you have group B, and you run them through something, right? And you change one thing about them, right? You change the instructions, or you change the whatever, and then you compare and say, okay, is there a difference here, right? Well, in StarCraft with custom games, you can do something similar. You can create a sort of ongoing experiment where you can always be trying things out. And to the extent that something doesn't work, you know, some custom map just isn't making people better, then you can drop it off the custom map list or give it a low rating, and people won't play it. And then you sort of have a natural cycling of information. And then as you get more and more data, you can ask more refined questions, right? You can and because you have some history, then you know what players are like in lots of different ways, and you can just, so I could take players who are in gold, who have a high, worker count and are doing all the macro things right, but their micro is low, and you can control for these other factors,
right, and
then only look at the one thing you're interested in. Where in a normal study, you know, when we just do people up in the lab, we just invite undergraduates who are signed up in psychology courses into the lab, and we don't know anything about them, right?
Right.
We don't know what they're doing. We have no idea what year they're in, where they're from, what they like to do. We have no information about them whatsoever. But if you had a kind of an ongoing academy thing, you would have some sense of the history behind each player, and that, you know, in the study of expertise is really the study about change. You know, change from one state through the acquisition of skill. And so it's really critical in these scenarios to have as much data about the history of players as possible. So one of the things we're going to do after, so we're writing the study up right now for publication in a scientific journal. Once that's sorted out, then we'll post online at Team Liquid and various other places exactly what the results are. But the next step after that is going to be games where we get as many replays as people have, right? So the Blizzard designers, geniuses that they are, had the little checkbox that says, you know, check this box to save all your replays.
Yep.
Right? And for us, that's like, oh, thank God. Yeah, like we had because there are people out there with thousands of replays.
Right.
And no study of expertise ever in the history of the planet has data on thousands of games from a single player. Right? That's just completely unheard of. Right? You look at an expert at a single point in time. Well, if somebody saved all their replays, like literally all of their replays, I mean that's amazing. It's amazing, and it would allow you to track exactly the progress on all the relevant variables, always, right? Right. You know, as scientists, we're always having this sampling problem, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to get a little sample of the data. I'm going to see your expertise at this particular time, or in this particular measure, this particular thing, and I'm making inferences about the rest of it. Well, if I have every one of your replays, I don't have to sample. I have all of the data. I have literally everything, and that's really amazing from a scientific standpoint. Like you could really get a lot of clarity about expertise and things that we're just guessing about currently, if we had that kind of stuff. So our next planned study, once we release the results from this one, is to try and get players from out in the community to just give us literally every replay they have. If they have 10,000 replays, then we're going to have a website, and you can just upload your 10,000 replays, and you'll be part of the biggest longitudinal study that's ever been conducted in the history of the world. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's where that's sort of one of the places we're headed is this sort of long-term, analysis of people as they improve. And I'm really excited, like as a player, especially as a player who doesn't have as much time to play as one would like. Like people would say, "Oh, how do you get better?" And I'm like, "Okay, don't start a major research study on StarCraft, because it'll screw up your game forever." Like I'm so bad. Like I can't micro anything. I feel like my hands are made of clay. I'm like, oh my god. So I'm as a player, I'm especially a player who has a limited amount of time. Like I'm really interested in okay, like I can't practice 8 hours a day, right? I'm not like Flash playing 60 hours of StarCraft 2 on the side, right? So I'm interested in how you get better with the limited time that you sort of got, and so these kinds of studies also are really appealing to me as a player, because I feel like, it'd be really great if we had some advice on what people should practice, right? What are the fundamentals that are most important? And if you've only got an hour a day, or you can only play 2 games a day, what do you do? Like, how do you manage that? And so I think I'm really interested in these sorts of longitudinal studies, both as a player and as a scientist.
So these longitudinal studies that haven't been done yet, but you're working towards, those are going to be useful so those will be useful in allowing you to assert causation. Is that what they'll be useful in doing?
Yeah, well, and also just the sort of they typically call these studies microgenetic studies, because you're seeing very small steps, right, of performance, and so they're actually not going to give us causal stuff. The causal stuff would come from the custom games where we manipulate and we turn off the minimap, or we do that kind of stuff. And that will give us the causal stuff. But what this will give us is a really fine-grained information about how performance changes over time. Right? Okay. So you imagine, you take, here's an expert and here's a novice, and that's what's been done before, and that sucks because you can't see anything in the middle. Well, what we've done with the first study is to give you a bunch of points in the middle and see, look, there's certain things like macro that seem to be important early on, but they're not so important later on. Other things are important, and hotkeys are important sort of in the middle, and then your micro is the main thing sort of at the top end. And so that's great. But if we had every game that a player ever played, like we could see exactly how all of those variables are changing at every point, not just at one point, but at every point. And then it could be that most players learn to macro, then they learn to use their hotkeys effectively, and then they are microing like a beast. But that some players are showing different patterns of performance. Like they really focus on their micro first, and the macro comes later. And we don't, from the study that we've got, it's hard for us to see those kinds of patterns because we don't see how any individual is changing. Like when we compare the bronze group to the gold group, they're totally separate people, right? And so when you've got all the data from bronze and gold from a single person, you have a much better sense of the trajectories that all those things are taking through time. So, but the other thing, really another thing is just looking at variability and stuff. And some people can do this, if you're saving your games and using SU2 gears or something to do analysis and check your APMs. Yeah. Stuff. But it's an interesting question: is how much variability is there in people's play, right? Like so, just take every game you play for a couple of weeks and see, are there is my APM low late at night? Is my APM better in the morning? Is how much are some of my games so bad that I actually look like I'm 2 leagues below, right? Because the classifier picks up on these sort of regularities, and it doesn't classify everybody perfectly. And you wonder, okay, this is a person who was just having an off day, or those kinds of things. So having a lot of data from a single person over a stretch of time is, can be useful for thinking about those kinds of things too, right? Because you think about like air traffic controllers, right? You want them to be awesome all the time because you don't want planes to smash into each other. That's bad. And so, but it might be that doing some kind of high stress thing like StarCraft or air traffic controlling, that after 6 hours, then all of a sudden there's a big crash in your performance, right? Or after 4 hours, there's a big crash in your performance. So you could look at things like that, like how do you time shifts of people doing these sort of high stress jobs so that they don't have a big crash, right? And so those kinds of things are also, you could also pick those up from longitudinal data, where you essentially have every single data point. So there's lots of really, I really think that the study of StarCraft or real-time strategy games in general, I suppose other games would work. I don't really play other games, so I don't think about them much. But studying real-time strategy games and analyzing replays and doing the kinds of things we're doing, coupled with the sort of experimental and longitudinal stuff that we're planning on, could really change the way expertise research is done. I mean, it's essentially what everybody has wanted to do for 100 years, but couldn't really do because you can never quite get the number of experts, you can never quite get the novices, you never quite measure the variables in the right way, and the whole thing is a mess. And so, I, as a scientific endeavor, I'm super enthusiastic about this style of research because I really feel like I think it's going to pave the way to a lot of other research that uses these sorts of techniques, and potentially in other fields. I mean, the more time we spend doing interesting and useful stuff on computer, the more ability we have to track our performance and track things, and that can be a really useful set of data. I mean, currently, tracking is primarily used for advertisers, right? But I think people tracking their own performance and own activities, StarCraft in this case, but potentially other things as well, can be a really valuable way of getting some insight into how you can tweak your performance to get the most out of your time.
It's really, I'm really glad that you were, in particular, you talked about some of the other applications that you foresee the research that you're going to do coming up, where you see that going. Because I was hearing this, I'm thinking, that's really cool. This is really, really interesting and fascinating. And I see how this relates to StarCraft, to the idea of expertise, but I don't see how the understanding of expertise expands into other fields and how that is applied. But talking about the aircraft controllers in particular really sort of brings it home, makes it concrete for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because you get this flip thing. Studying expertise is very similar across fields, right? You automatize motor actions, you get faster at cognitive decision making and perceptual processing, and there's sort of predictable physiological changes in the brain and how information is processed and so forth. And so expertise is just your brain adapting to the experiences that it's having, right? And so that's going to be slightly different than in music than in StarCraft, but there's going to be a lot of similarities, right? I mean, there's motor performance and there's all these sorts of things. So studying expertise is actually pretty broadly applicable because it's essentially your brain just adapting to whatever it's doing. On the flip side, expertise itself tends not to be very generalizable. So your performance at StarCraft is not going to help you, generally speaking, in business or in any of the, in any other sort of field. I get a lot of questions. I mean, there's a bit of transfer, right? There's some indication that it's going to change certain things. The video games in general are going to improve certain things, maybe. But I think generally speaking, the evidence is that those transfer effects are relatively small, and that basically when you become an expert at StarCraft, you become an expert at StarCraft. Right. I personally don't see anything wrong with that, but it's sort of interesting in a weird way that studying StarCraft doesn't really make you an expert at anything else, but studying the expertise of StarCraft can generally be useful at a number of different sorts of things, right? You get a sense of how these things happen and what kinds of things you need to look for early in training and late in training, and it can be more broadly applicable. So I find that a slight irony that it works out that way. But
yeah.
Anyway, interesting to note.
It is indeed. All right. We normally would do a second half, but I'm thinking the best thing for us to do. We've got about an hour, and I would love an excuse to have you come on again at some point later on. So, what do you say to maybe after the study is published and you guys are start working on moving forward, we get you back on to talk about this part 2, and then we can also spend some time talking about, because I want to know, I really want to be able to ask you about how you got into cognitive science, what about gaming, but that to me is like a full hour worth of story. So I feel like I don't want to rush it. I don't want to lose that.
Fair enough.
So I think we'll go ahead and do that, which means I'll also save. I was going to ask you movies, music, books, and food, but I'll save that too. We'll save it all for later. We'll come back and we're going to have a whole other interview. We just ask you about everything related to gaming, to science, to hobbies, and all the like. So for this week, it was very science heavy, but I love the change of pace. I mean, it was. I'm just actually really happy that I got the chance to sit down with you, because I've had a chance to again go through the AMAs and sort of watch a couple of the interviews, read some of the feedback, the response, the blogs that have been done about the research at various stages. But it wasn't quite clicking for me, and now it's starting to really settle in about what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and where it's applicable. It's really cool. It's really cool. So, with that, guys, if you have any last-minute questions, go ahead and ask them. And while you're hopefully typing them out real quick, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Mark, thank you so much.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure, and sorry I tend to ramble. So
no, I mean
we'll do it again, so
yeah.
I can get more questions answered.
I mean, to be quite honest, I was actually more concerned about you being too quiet. I was worried I'd be asking you questions and the answers would be short, or they would be very stilted, and then I'd have to try and figure out something else to answer. Nope. I mean, you obviously love talking about what you do. You're obviously very passionate, and it comes through, and I had a blast. I love not saying anything. I don't have to speak when I can just listen and hear about the expertise, the knowledge of somebody else. It's an absolute joy, so thank you.
Yeah, great.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. All right. See ya.
Links to the stuff. Well, you said when you guys will do a release for TL later after.
Yeah. We'll do a sort of gamer-oriented write-up once we get everything sorted out on the academic. Yeah, the academic end. They're a little fussy about you releasing results prior to the academic process, so we sort of have to hold off until we get things worked out on the journal end. Do we know rough estimate when we can expect that? Yeah, well, if you'd asked me a year ago how long it would take, I would have given you a very different answer than now. But it'll probably be at least a couple of months. Okay. I mean, we're most of the way through the write-up, but the peer review process is not fast. No. Yeah. No, so, I'm aware. Yeah. But as soon as it sort of gets officially accepted someplace, then I can start sort of talking about it, and I'll work on the TL post and stuff right then. So. Wonderful. All right, guys. So sounds like just thing to do is for now sit on your hands, wait a little bit more, and when Mark can talk about it, he'll certainly let us know, and we're going to get him back. Don't worry about that. We'll be getting him back so he can give us the updates again. But let's see. Next week. We don't have anyone lined up next week. One of the things that Gimble and I are talking about doing is throwing around some ideas for modifying the show slightly, and we'll keep you guys updated. But we've been noticing there are a lot of shows very much like ours, and we still want to contribute to the community, but we want to do it in the best way possible. So we're thinking about how we can really specialize a little bit more, so that the content we're providing is something that you can't find elsewhere and that is meaningful.
Because there are a lot of we're finding now that there are a lot of shows that have me interviewing players or commentators and really trying to get to the more personal side, which is wonderful. But it means that we want to sort of look at ourselves again. So when we get a guest for next week, and from here on out, we'll definitely let you know when we decide what that new direction of the show is going to be. We'll also sort of let everyone know. But for now, Mark, again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right, guys, we'll catch you next week.